Every country is in debt, no doubt. But again, there are some countries that are in debt, but they have development strategies. And so far, so good. We know, according to our records, the United States is the most indebted country in the world. But everybody wants to be a United States, citizen, or even the country still values its assets across board. The other persons would say, look, other countries are in debt. These are developed countries that are in debt. Well, what was the difference between developed countries that are in debt, like the United States, the UK, or even China, and countries that are developing and are in debt? How much of these debts are being championed or are being channeled towards development in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, or even in terms of human capital development? Nigeria has hit $150 billion debt. But to what extent would this in any way grow our economy? Say in another, say, 5, 6, or even 10 years. We have with us live in the studio Mr. Ifediora Amobi, is a development economist, to unpack this for us. Good to have you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, sir. You're welcome.
So people would say, yeah, everyone is in debt, no doubt. Every country is in debt. But again, the most important thing is how important are these debts to the economy of that nation, and how have they been able to use the money borrowed in order to grow their its economy. Can you tell us the difference between developed countries that are in debt and developed countries that are not in debt?
Developed countries that are in debt and developed countries
that are in debt.
Developing countries that are in debt. Okay. Yes, the first major difference is the currency. Developing countries in debt borrow in currencies that are not theirs. Take Nigeria, for instance. Our debt is dollar denominated. And so not only is it high, 150 billion is a lot of money. Not only is it high, but repayment becomes a problem if our currency becomes weaker. So if you take a country like the US that borrows in its own currency, or maybe some countries in Europe that have stronger currencies, over time, what they are paying back isn't, the effect isn't as hard as countries like Nigeria, Ghana, or some other developing countries. And so the fact that we borrow in pounds or dollars or euro makes it even, puts more burden on us to pay back because of depreciation, devaluation, etc. that happens over time within our own economies. And so it actually digs us deeper into this debt pit as we are struggling to pay back what we have borrowed. And so every time we borrow as a country, for some of us economic analysts, we're not just looking at the figure itself, $150 billion, but we're looking at what will the exchange rate be tomorrow when we're now paying back. Because we're not going to pay back 150 billion naira. We're going to be paying back in trillions.
But naira. What happens when you borrow? Are you mandated to devalue your currency? And what is the idea around almost always devaluing currencies?
Well, most of the time, borrowing comes with conditions. Now, and we have to really put everything on the table here. The person lending you money is also a transaction, partner to you. They're not giving you the money because they really love the look of your face, right? So every lender wants to make money and interest from what they're lending to you, right? So it's up to you to make sure that, first and foremost, what you're borrowing is really critical to what you want to use the money for, as well as ensure that there will be returns on that money that you've borrowed, so that when you're paying back, it cushions the effect of repayment at that time. So, like we say on the streets, if you borrow for one day, when you're paying back, there's no return, right? And so, as a developing country like Nigeria, we have to be very, very meticulous and very, very careful when we borrow. It's not every low interest or loan that is waved at us that we should go and grab. No, because what it actually defines or translates to is that we are not good economic planners. I am from the old neoclassical school that believes that you only borrow in cases of emergency. And so, if as an oil producing country, or an oil exporting country that we are, if I estimate that my revenue stream is going to be $1 billion in 2025, I plan my expenditure around what I'm going to earn. Fine, I might have a slight deficit, which is a budget deficit, the difference between your revenue and what you spend. But I don't come up with an over-bloated deficit because I expect to earn something that is not certain. Economic planners or good economic planners are a bit more conservative. Most especially in today's world that is laced with all sorts of uncertainties. Now, the US, you mentioned, does its own thing, but today, country's view of the US under the current President Trump is not the same US that we've always known. And so it heightens that uncertainty space because nobody knows what pronouncement, what executive order he's going to sign tomorrow that will affect, developing countries like ours. So we have to be very, very cautious when we're borrowing because we're borrowing in their own currency. See, and so as we plan, this is how much we're going to make, this is how much we plan to spend for the year. If there's a windfall, we manage the windfall. If we earn slightly less than that at the end of the year, it's easier to manage our deficit than to go ahead and borrow to pay this deficit. So what we're doing now is, in today's Nigeria 2025 budget, is we're going to earn $1 million from oil and other sources, but we're going to spend $5 million. So we have a budget deficit of $4 million. How do we finance it? We go and borrow. So we find out now that today in Nigeria, our revenue to debt ratio is so high. As at July last year, it was over 100%, which means that every naira or dollar that we were earning as a country, we were using that to pay off debt. So if I'm going to make $1 billion or $1 million, why will I now spend more than that and then borrow to now finance that? Why don't I just use that $1 million and be a bit more disciplined and cautious and spend on the projects and programs of the sectors that I have prioritized within that period? Then next year, I focus on other areas. Because what free money does, and I use the word freely because there's still an interest that you pay, when these carrots are dangled in front of our decision makers and they go and grab from World Bank, from France, from Germany, from AFDB, from this, that, what it does now is that it now makes us spend frivolously. Because we're now looking at things that we didn't even plan for before. But we're now saying, you know what? We can actually build a new airport. We can now, complete the vice president's house. We can now buy a yacht. We can buy a presidential jet. These are things that were not part of what, of what we had planned for under our revenue. We were thinking about financing them from borrowing.
Ifediora, let's go back to 2005. That's about 2 decades now, when Nigeria made steps towards debt relief.
Absolutely.
And by 2016, Nigeria paid off about $18 billion, and that debt relief was about $18 billion. Nigeria made certain its final payments, and the books were cleared of any pari clause debt for Nigeria. But coming down towards the past decade, just about 10 years, or streamline it to bring it down to 5 years at least, how did we get the debt profile to rise up to this tune? It's $15 billion now. $150 billion now.
Yes. Well, see, what has happened is, first, financial indiscipline. Second, we have had leaders that have had full control over the National Assembly. So you have lawmakers, instead of making these arguments and putting their foot down, they just rubber stamp. So whatever the president wants. Under President Buhari, for instance, the 8 years of Buhari, the debt ballooned because not only were we just borrowing, just like we're borrowing today, but we abused, and I've used the word abused, the ways and means method of financing projects. Now, what do we mean by ways and means? Ways and means is actually a way whereby the federal government borrows from the central bank. And the federal government does borrow from the central bank. So it's not just from the World Bank and IMF. Central bank lends to the federal government. But the laws behind the ways and means states that the federal government cannot borrow more than 5% of the previous government's year's revenue. And it is a short term. So what the central bank does and what the law stipulates is that the CBN can lend to the federal government, and that's why the CBN is called bank of last resort. They can lend to the federal government to take care of certain short-term obligations and then repay back. That's why it's only limited to 5%. Under the Buhari administration, at a point, we had exceeded that 5% to over 2,000%.
Wow.
So over those years, we had gone from a small amount, less than 1 trillion naira of borrowing from central bank, to over 20-something trillion naira, which is what the current government inherited. And instead of now trying to see how that can be managed, we just continued like that. And so right now, there has been gross financial, indiscipline, and not having that checks and balance, which is what either the National Assembly or the opposition is supposed to be, highlighting and calling the government to order.
Now, these organizations, countries keep extending these facilities to Nigeria despite the seeming inability of Nigeria to pay.
Yeah.
There's something fishy about this.
No, there's nothing fishy about it. It's just interest rate. If I lend money to you at 10% per annum, and you pay me back in 3 months, I only get, a quarter of what I was supposed to have earned in interest. But if you hold the money for 1 year, I get the 100%, 10%. If I extend it another year, I get another 10%. So as long as you're owing, at a point, that $10 million I gave you, over time, I have recovered more than that in interest, and I'm still expecting the $10 million. That's why I said there's nothing like free money. Anybody who's giving you money, it's a transaction. All these institutions and countries that lend money, to them, it's actually, if I have extra funds in Nigeria, as Nigeria a country, why would I let them just sit idle? I'll say, hey, Togo, Malaysia, come and borrow. We agree terms, and as Nigeria is sleeping, Nigeria is making money. Because if that government doesn't pay back, their children will. And the longer, part of the debt relief that you mentioned earlier on, a big chunk of that 18 billion was interest and charges. not even the principal itself. But we cleared it, and then we went back again, and now we're doing it in a digital way. We've really we've ballooned it. So how are we going to pay back? What are we really going to do?
But based on your analysis as to good economists actually budget stuff within their revenue base. You don't budget and hoping to borrow and finance the deficits, even though that's what people do. This government, the previous government have done that over and over again. But you said it's a wrong move, and that good budgeting has to do with projected revenue of that particular year. That if you do that, then that means you're putting yourself, at a ledge. But again, I just wanted to ask, is it good economists that you are almost always indebted? Because, you hear people say that the best country in the world is in debt. So why don't you be in debt? Like, if good economists is budgeting within the framework of your revenue, why do countries that are seeming to be good or seeming to have good economy, still do these voodoo economies of, having to borrow in order to finance a budget?
Yeah, well, borrowing in itself is not bad. It is, a lot of people will say it's what you do with the money. That's on one side. On the other side, it's your capacity. Your capacity to repay. Countries that are heavily indebted, even within Nigeria, states that are heavily indebted, like Lagos State. Lagos has, the highest debt relative to other, states in Nigeria. But Lagos has that capacity to generate the kind of revenue required to service that debt. If another state does what Lagos does, that state will sink. So countries that are heavily indebted have the capacity, they have the productive base, they have the exports. So, they can pay off that debt. However, you look at it this way. Let's say I am an importer now, and I bring in container loads of, say, ceiling fans, right, from another country. And there's a big market for ceiling fans in Nigeria. And there are people out there at the ports who will clear these goods for me and then pay me immediately. I will go to the bank and I will borrow, and it doesn't really matter how, what rate the bank gives me. Because within a short period of time, once the ship lands and the goods are cleared, they are cleared, I get my money, I pay off the bank, I have so much profit. I order another shipload. So, am I, heavily indebted? Yes, I am. But it's good for me. It is good business. So most times it's not really the figure. You could see, okay, US will tell you that the US debt is in trillions of dollars. The UK debt, Germany's debt, everybody is in trillions of dollars. But they have a productive base that they can use, and they've done their numbers. They've actually offset, okay, if we pay off this debt, then we'll now sacrifice XYZ. But if we stick with XYZ, we make enough to cover the debt. So they don't lose sleep over it. But when you look at their books and you see debt, and you look at Nigeria and you see debt, but what you have to also look at, like I mentioned earlier on, is the debt service. How much of your revenue is now used to service those debts? These heavily developed countries, their debt to revenue ratio is quite low. Nigeria, we're hitting about 60, 70%, at a point we're even up to 80, 90%. So every penny we've made from oil is used to service our debt. So it's not just the figure, it's actually how you manage, the debt management itself. See?
Right. Again, you have spoken largely about productivity, how the country is productive enough, to cover for its debts. That's the reason why they would remain in debt, and they will go by that status. But as a country, Nigeria, as it stands right now, we're not in that space just yet. It's just recently we started doing debt to revenue around 60%. Previously, it's been over 90%.
Yeah.
And that's because this government came out and started firing all sorts of more cylinders with taxes.
Absolutely.
And there is now more monies to the government. And he also stated that he's putting monies in the hands of governors across boards, that governors are earning 3 times what they usually earn, even though as it stands, it doesn't look like it, really. So with what you know and what we are seeing in that space, for instance, how do you think this is going to be sustainable if we continue with this trajectory of borrowing? And what is the effect of this debt, $150 billion, to investment, to our growth as a nation, and even to the GDP?
Well, will it be sustainable? No, we can't sustain this. It is going to wreck us. It's going to wreck our children, the future generations, because we don't have the capacity at this time to handle that, those or that huge number. Now, how is it going to affect the economy? Not positive, because even with now, first of all, if I bring in a new word now, which I call impact, which hovers around the question that you just asked. All this that we're borrowing, what is the impact? How has it affected you and I? How has it affected the average Nigerian on the street? Are we better off? Are prices cheaper? Are we paying less for basic services? And the answer is no. Tariffs and hikes, tariffs are still being hiked in every sector, whether it's power, communications, etc. Taxes are still being increased. Prices in the markets are still high, whether they are food or household items. So, what really is the impact of all this borrowing in the long run? And if the impact cannot really be defined or cannot be seen, then something's wrong. Either the money is not being used used for what it's supposed to be used, or we're not really planning properly.
Now that you have taken us to this part, talking about the impact, I, listened to you when you were, your analysis was tending towards the fact that we do not borrow in our currency. And so we are also considering exchange rate.
Exactly.
Okay, so probably an organization is extending 150 billion, let's say 150 billion facility to us in dollars.
Yes.
When we convert it, it's running in trillions of naira. And so now that we're talking about the impact, let's look at how this affects the economy, the investment climate, the value of the naira. Is that why we are where we are?
To a large extent. To a very, very large extent. Now, we've been running a palliative, economy, where an individual can come out and say, okay, I'm donating 1 billion. I'm donating, 600 million to some cause or something. A governor can come and say, oh, okay, there was a flood here. I'm putting, 700 million. So you have all these big figures being lobbied back and forth. And this is from the public sector, not even from the private sector. And that's why I didn't even mention like an IBB, type book, because those are mostly private sector, donations, which will live on the side. But in the public space, if we have this kind of cash that we can just throw around when things happen, what it now tells us is that we have, we don't have to borrow as much because we can utilize that cash effectively, right? You see, and so it's the impact of this huge debt on the business environment and doing business better in Nigeria and providing incentives and so on. So many of those things can be provided if it's planned properly. But because we are into spraying and everything, and everybody wants to show off, and money is not channeled properly. And so we go back to the same word again, impact. The impact is not felt. Because if tomorrow or 6 months from now, Our debt goes from 150
billion
to 250 billion naira. Dollars. It's not going to make much of a difference. Anybody driving here will still go through the same potholes. NEPA will still stick the same light. And when it's time for tariff increases, you have to pay that increase in the various sectors.
And then should we borrow? Is it the appropriate economic step to take?
Well, economies borrow, companies borrow, individuals borrow. But like I said earlier on, I'm from the old neoclassical school that believes that you only borrow when it is necessary. If you have an economic emergency, that means that you have planned your revenue, you've planned your expenditure, but something came up. And you say, I have to take care of this, otherwise it's going to throw everything else off. Not because somebody dangled a carrot in front of my ears and said, oh, here's $1 billion, you can get for 0.5% interest less than so.
All right. Development economist, Mr. Ifediora, giving us an in-depth analysis about this $150 billion that has been our debt on our neck. Right. I want to say a very big thank you for your time and your analysis on this issue. I truly appreciate you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Save Nature TV. News in your pocket.